Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 9th Business Health Workshop. And today's session is all about reclaiming your time management. So, welcome. For those of you who haven't come across us before or attended previous webinars, I'm Mark Lawson, and I'm director and owner of a business accountancy firm called Business Vision in Plymouth. And our main aim, as well as doing all the normal accountancy stuff, is really helping small businesses become more profitable, make more sales, and effectively have more enjoyment out of it. And a big part of that will obviously be time management, today's session. So just a quick run through of the logistics. So we're using GoToWebinar, so you should have a little control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. And you can basically minimize or expand that by just clicking on the little orange arrow. If there's any workbooks, you can effectively get that in the handout section, and you can use computer audio or you can dial in on the phone. Either will work. But you are muted, so we won't be able to hear you. Hopefully you can just all hear me. At the end, if we have time, we'll be running through questions and answers, so we'll do a Q&A session at the end, as always. So if you come across anything as you're going through, do jot in questions, and if we have time at the end, we'll go through those, or as many as we can, and get some answers. If there isn't time, then I'll make a note of those questions and come back to you individually anyway. Okay, agenda for today. So a brief introduction about time management, and then we'll go through why I think that people and businesses are always going to be busy. Then we're going to look at some mindsets on how to reclaim time. Then we'll have a look at 5 big ways of freeing up time. And then we'll go into some quick tips and just a run through of some apps that may help. So just some quick bullet points on things that may help. And then we're going to go through what to do with the time that you are gaining, hopefully by attending today. Then we'll go through some next steps, things that you can carry on doing. And then, as I said, we'll go into the Q&A session at the end, time permitting. So thought for the day is basically either run the day or the day runs you. And that's really all about controlling time. And the irony is not lost on me on the fact that everybody here today probably is already starting to reclaim time, which is great, so I appreciate that. But the people who really need to hear these messages probably aren't attending because they're busy, haven't managed to fit it into their daily work schedule. Having said that, if you're listening to this on a recording on YouTube, then I just take back everything I've just said. So that quote there from Jim Rohn, one of the well-known business gurus, is really a reflection on the theme for today, is how to basically take control of time wherever possible. So that's to say the agenda, and what I'd recommend you do is to basically take notes wherever you can, and if you come up with anything in terms of questions, jot those down and we'll try and deal with those as well. But the aim at the end of the session is to try and find at least 3 things that you've picked up on that you can then move forward with in your business and personal life, because time management is about both. So before we go through the main sort of key points, this is a version of something we did ages ago. We ran a live seminar. We used to do loads of live seminars back when they were possible. And one of the ones we did was time management. And we had an exercise where I had, I think it was a red ribbon that was about, I don't know, 10 feet wide. We went through with a particular person, but it was fairly generic explanation about if that ribbon represented their life, how much of that was left. So we then cut it at the appropriate bit where they'd reached on that rough time span. And we then went through some other bits about where the rest of their time was going. So we can't do that today. We can't be as theatrical as that. So what I've done is just given you a grid. And what that does, if you look up roughly your age now on the left, And we're then basically assuming, just for the purposes of today, it's not that important, that let's say you're going to retire from business at 65. And then we've got what we call cash out. And if you've ever read the probably the best business book for small businesses, the E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber, he refers to this as your crap out day, which is basically, without getting too morbid, the day that you cease to exist. And the reality is that we all have one. So what I've done in this grid is basically listed two things. So under the retire at 65 column, I've listed how many days between your age on the left and your retirement date. And now you'll see there that I haven't gone below 40 because I suspect that if you're under 40, you're probably not going to be here today, and time management probably isn't quite such a big issue for you as for the rest of us who are older. I've also put in 70, which basically means if you are in attendance today and you're over 65 or 70, then the reality is you probably aren't retiring at 65, and time management probably is even more crucial for you unless you're doing a business that's making loads of money and you enjoy it. So the two cash out columns, the crap out days, are basically looking at the life expectancy of men and women. So if it says M, that's men, and if it says F, that's women, and that's based on the rough dates that I can pick up for life expectancy for males and females, and it is obviously a shorter date for men, unfortunately, and that's basically the number of hours after 65 you have until your cash out day. And that's just obviously, I say without getting too morbid, putting things into perspective. But the key question with that is, we've got those days, it's probably not as many as you can imagine, but what are we going to do with them? What have we been doing with them? And that's the key question. It always has been the key question with time management. But before we go into that in more detail, let's just look at where our time is going on average. So research, this is UK, and I think there is research online that goes through various countries, and these do vary a bit, which is interesting. But on average in the UK, we spend 35% of our time sleeping or waiting. We spend 5% eating and drinking, 9% watching TV on the iPad or whatever, 8% doing housework and shopping. Now, I'm appreciative of the fact that myself and other men attending, probably we aren't quite reaching our quota on that, so it may not be the full 8%, but that's the average, and 15% on other leisure activities. So if you tot all that up, it basically means that 3/4 of your days are going to be spent doing those things on average. So we only have 1/4 of the days that I've just highlighted available. So those numbers, if you just take 1/4, now illustrate how many days we've got left if we ignore all those other things that pretty much are the things that we have to do outside business and to some extent personal life. And that focuses the mind a little bit on exactly how many days and weeks that we have left to do these sort of things. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense in terms of what that does. Not quite the same as having the ribbon demonstration, but the point is that time is limited, and the question has always been, how are we going to make best use of that? And hopefully today will help you go through that in a bit more detail. So let's just look at why I think we're always going to be busy. And the reality is that for all of us, you can't actually manage time. There is only 24 hours in a day, and that's the same for everybody, whether you're, Prime Minister, President of the United States, or just running a small business, or you're a teenager going to school. It's still the same 24 hours. You can't change that. It's a question of what you're doing with those 24 hours that's probably more important. So why will we always be busy? Well, the reality is that work will always expand to fill the time available, and not just work, but things. The reality is there have to be something in those 24 hours. There's never a point where we're actually not doing anything. Even if we're sleeping, we're sleeping. So the reality is the 24 hours is always going to be filled. That's what's called living. The question is, what's it filled with? So work will always expand to fill the time. It's a question of what you put into that time. There's also no shortage of distractions, particularly now, in the digital era. The distractions are numerous and constant. And the reality is that research shows that the human brain takes about 23 minutes to refocus after a distraction. So if you're working on a piece of work or doing an exercise or whatever it might be, and let's say you go to check your email or your phone pings and you look at the text, or you just suddenly decide to have a look at internet or whatever it might be, it's going to take you nearly half an hour to get back to the level of focus you were at. And I suspect that the number of distractions we have happen more frequently than 23 minutes, which basically means that we're working through the whole day doing stuff where we're not fully focused. And that's a big issue today, I think. There's also our perception of busyness. It's all relative. So, for example, when you're a teenager at school, then you might consider that 1 hour of homework, is a huge amount of time, and it makes them feel busy. A university student might be more familiar to doing, maybe 3 or 4 hours a day, and they think that's basically increasing their workload. And then if you're set up in business, then obviously that becomes even bigger, and we feel busy again. But it's all relative. We always feel busy at each point in time, even though the hours might be different. There's also a perception, I think, that being busy means successful. So, if anybody speaks to another business person and say, how's it going? They never usually go, oh, I'm struggling to fill my day. I'm bored. I don't have anything to do. It's always, oh, it's busy. And that, contained its own negative connotations, particularly if you're looking for more work. It tends to put clients and customers off referring you new work. So there's a perception that busy is some sort of badge of success, and not being busy is negative. But probably the main one is that being too busy is often an excuse. So we basically do work that we like to do or that we choose to do. And that's all about choices. So we choose to do the things we do pretty much during the day. And it's really about how we reclaim some of that time. But if we're in business particularly, we get even more choice about what we do. So maybe it's the mindset that's the crucial issue, rather than people just throwing busyness at us. So we'll start to look at some mindsets just to see how that can help reclaim time, and how reframing it slightly or thinking about it differently might help. So this is basically a little graphic about the 7 habits of highly effective people. It's based on the book and the principle which Stephen Covey, who again is one of the world's leading business authors, came up with. And we'll just concentrate on effectively 3 because they're the most relevant to time management and reclaiming time. So the first one is basically to be proactive, and that effectively means to make choices about what you do. I say we choose pretty much what we do with our lives and how we work those hours. So it's about being proactive with that choice rather than letting things happen to us. We make things happen. The second point is about beginning with the end in mind. So it's working out where we're trying to get to and to do things that are actually going to get us to that point. And I think that's even more relevant in business possibly than private life, is if we know where we're trying to get to, we should be basically doing things that are going to be part of that process to help us get from A to B. And the last one is to put first things first. So that's setting priorities and making sure that the things we do first are the most effective, the most important, and that we don't waste time doing non-important stuff. So all of those 3 key areas of the 7 habits are, I think, crucial to be aware of and to follow. And if you haven't read the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People book, then I strongly recommend you do. It's not an easy read, but just understanding the 7 principles is really helpful. The other ones, just so for completeness really, win-win is thinking win-win is just basically thinking both sides. So we did a seminar or webinar a couple of months ago about the sales process, and that is now about making it work for both parties. It's not foot in the door, I'm going to force you to sell. It's about both parties coming out of that happy, and that's about time management as well. Seeking first to understand, then to be understood. That's basically thinking, listening before talking, thinking, listening before acting, which again makes a lot of sense. And then synergizing, which is to look at the process of some things when they work together are more powerful. So 1 + 1 may equal 3 in certain cases. And we've come across that in business life where 1% in a number of things actually produces far more than 1% improvement in profits and cash flow. And then there's the 7th habit, which is sharpening the saw. And that sort of comes from apparently from a saying from Abraham Lincoln, who said that if he had to spend 6 hours chopping a tree, he'd spend the first 4 hours sharpening the saw. And in business life, that basically means making sure the systems are there so that when we spend the hours doing stuff, we're doing it effectively. Again, we see a lot of things in business where we spend a lot of time doing stuff for little reward or movement, and it's because it's not effective work. We haven't got the systems in place. So hopefully that makes some sense. This next one is something I call the Orebed Model, and that's really, again, following on from the bit before about being proactive. It's taking ownership about what you do. So going through those items there, ownership is about, I say, being proactive and focusing on what you can control, being accountable for it, and being responsible. They're all what I call above the line type mindsets, and that makes, I say there are various words, but in this case it basically makes you the victor, and that can be a retrospective of choice, making a choice, being proactive and choosing to be those things. Whereas below the line, and bear in mind this can apply to team members just as much as us, is to blame lack of time and poor time management on other things or other people, to find excuses and to basically deny the reality of what's going on. And that is basically putting you into a victim mode because you're justifying the reality rather than taking control of it and making it different. Next mindset we'll look at is called creating atomic habits. And that's really just, again, about a little bit about starting with the end in mind. So what we find with habits is there's often a cue. So if we think about, as an example, getting an email or a text, so the phone pings or your computer pings and you know that there's something there to read. That's the cue. Then there's basically a craving to feel the need to read it or look at it straight away. And that's where you get a sort of dopamine hit for looking at that. It makes the brain feel happier. And then basically there's a response, so deal with that. So you might go, oh, I can quickly look at that or read it or send a reply. And 10 minutes later, you've hit send, and that's your response. And then basically the reward is that you feel satisfied that you've basically dealt with that and you've responded to the client or the friend's email or text. And what we really need to do with atomic habits is to basically change what that whole process of habits is and where it comes from. So if we could imagine a similar situation where we basically turn off the email pinger and the text pinger on our phones or computers, and actually the cue then would be to have a handwritten to-do list or a written to-do list that we can work from. That would be the cue. The craving becomes the dopamine hit from ticking off those to-do list actions. The response is to get those tasks done, and the reward can either be that in itself, or even better, you can actually have rewards that you create when you've got to a certain point with those habits. So again, that's part of about moving away from things that happen to you to actually creating a slightly different way. It's still using the human brain and the way it works, but using it in a slightly different way, more proactive, less reactive. So that's just a few mindset things. So I don't want to get too much into the psychology, but the reality is time management and reclaiming time is partly about human nature. So let's just look at where time's going. And this is hopefully a reasonably well-known graphic. And this is called the achiever matrix. And what it does is it basically has along the top 2 types of work, urgent or not urgent, and down the side, important or not important. And in each quadrant, it will define what type of work is there. And also we can then go through and go, how are we going to deal with this? So quadrant 1 is called the quadrant of urgency, and that's basically headless chicken phase. So it's crises, things that have to be done now. It's all deadline driven, running around with little ability to sort things out, which we might think urgent and important is actually where everything should be. We'll come back to that. Then we've got number 2 is not urgent and important, and that's called the quadrant of quality. So that's where there's things happening to prevent. So if we look at that in terms of medicine and hospitals, urgency would be admitting people with issues and problems and trying to sort it out. Number 2 quadrant is actually doing preventative work so that number 1 doesn't happen. And that's about clarifying values, planning, systems, empowerment for other people and so on. And that's probably where we want to end up. We as business owners are doing important stuff and it's not urgent. Number 3 is basically urgent but not important. So that's things like generally interruptions, phone calls, dealing with other staff queries, client queries, lots of popular activities, emails, that sort of thing, what I call bubble wrap type stuff. Some meetings, certainly we'll come on to meetings later. And then number 4 is what we call the quadrant of waste, where it's not urgent and not important. So that's just trivia, junk emails, phone calls, time wasters, escape activities, all that sort of thing. Now, quadrant of waste is generally to be avoided. There are some occasions where in order to free up the mind, some escape activities are permissible because they are permitting mindfulness. But generally where we want to be is in quadrant 2. So what I suggest, one of the things you could do is to go through what would be a typical cycle for your work, whether that's weekly or monthly, depends on what you do, and just list of all the things you do, which quadrant you think they're falling into. And certainly as a business owner, although you can downgrade this for any level of work, you shouldn't be doing urgent stuff. And what you need to do is to get that stuff to move across to urgent. So if you know you're doing a lot of firefighting, then the way to correct that is to use quadrant 2 to prepare systems to work out why things are becoming a crisis, why they're coming up against deadlines, and try and prevent it. So moving from quadrant 1 to quadrant 2 is one of the most important things to do, because not only is that where things go wrong, but it's also very stressful and not good for any business or even life, to be honest. Quadrant 3 certainly for business owners, but generally that's not important but urgent. So the question is, if it's urgent, not important, I don't think at the business owner level or even at any top level that is where you want to be. And that to a large extent is either get rid of it completely or get rid of it to somebody else. And then quadrant 4 we just need to get rid of, basically. If we don't need to be doing it, it's not urgent, it's not important, then I would say nobody needs to be doing that, so don't even delegate it. So ultimately we all want to end up in quadrant 2, and it's really about what can we do from day to day to assist that. It's not going to be obviously a quick process, because you're not going to go from urgent deadline driven work to basically everything being straightforward and simple, but moving that forward will certainly help. Excuse me. And you'll find that the most successful businesses have quadrant 2 a lot more sorted than other businesses. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but more sorted. So what can we do to free up some time? So we'll go through 5 steps. These aren't exclusive, there are other ones. They're just the 5 that I think would be most useful for today. So the first one is to utilize the productivity pyramid. And that's looking at time spent versus the return on that time. So as with money, we're looking at a return on our investment. So if we spend time, we want to get the maximum out of it, particularly if we're business owners. So at the bottom level, we're just looking at improving, so get better at the work you're doing, master the expertise. And that's obviously a general process, and the better we get at that, the more return we should get for our time and the less time we should be spending. Then we've got basically delegating, so we get more people to do what we're doing. And I would argue that the typical reaction from business owners, which is it's cheaper to do it myself, isn't really a great return on time invested. And we'll go through why a bit later. Then we can go into the invest stage, where you're invested in technology, systems and software, whether it's internal or external, to basically scale up the return on your time. You then invent systems and technology, so you're creating things within your business. And the last one is to innovate, where basically you're creating brand new ways of working on better things. And that's the highest return with the lowest time investment, which is what we ultimately want. And we often see in businesses that it's the reverse, that business owners are working often for little more than the staff are getting, and that can't be right. So happy to go through that productivity pyramid if anybody wants to, or send you the graphics. So with all of these graphics, they're available to request if you want them. Second strategy is to stop working with the wrong people. They will drain time, and you'll find that the most successful people pick very carefully who they work with, and they do that in a way that's going to basically move them forward rather than drag them back. So very quickly, just avoid working with people who people and customers don't pay your invoices on time, treat your team badly, don't buy into your business core values, and generally unreliable. So you can choose with time and with business who you work with. So again, that should all be focused on getting you from A to B, and you choose who your customers are. You can certainly choose not to work with them if you want. There is a knee-jerk reaction that says we must work with everybody, not something I believe is correct. Next one, strategy 3, we see a lot of time being wasted on meetings. So this will be more relevant to people here in different ways, depending on how many people in your team, how many meetings you have. But again, they are potentially time wasters. So we've got a few little ideas on how to run meetings better. One obviously is to set a time limit and stick to it. If you feel that there are issues making the business meeting going over, then rearrange stuff outside the meeting. So always have a set time limit and let everybody know when it's starting and when it finishes. And if people know when it starts, they have to be there ready to start at that time. So time limit is if it's a toolbox meeting, I would say 10 minutes. If it's a monthly team meeting, maybe 45 minutes. And I would also recommend that you have agendas, and on the agendas you can actually allocate the breakdown of the meeting time into those areas, because what you'll often find is you get to point 2 of 10 and that's used up 90% of your time, and then you rush through the last bits, which are often the most important. So report prior to meeting. It's always best to set up meetings in advance. If you want them to think about something or come up with ideas, get that set out in advance. Otherwise, they're just going to turn up to the meeting and spend the whole time thinking about stuff they could have come to the meeting with. And if there's anything, like business figures and stuff like that, that you're going to go through, send those out in advance and suggest politely that they ought to read that before the meeting. I think having a regular meeting with them for teams is really, really good. So having weekly team huddles, team meetings about what's going on in the week, and then regular management meetings, maybe monthly, and then regular top level meetings, maybe 6 monthly. That's what we do in our business. We have a half-hour Monday meeting where we all go through the work that's due, the good things that happened the week before, who's got what work to do, what's urgent, what's not, and so on, what people are doing, who's coming in, those sort of things for half an hour. We do that every week. and people have to turn up to that. Unless they're sick or dead, then they have to be there. And then obviously we have monthly meetings where we go through our figures with the team, discuss those and maybe set goals for the next month. And then we have the management meetings every 6 months where we will spend half a day to 2 days going through strategy and stuff like that. So that's what we call a regular rhythm. We just said clear purpose and agenda. So everybody needs to know what the aim of the meeting is and what's on the agenda to get to that aim. Then you would need to basically, at the end, agree action. So what things need to be done, and avoid lengthy discussions about those. If you've done all the other things first, then that should be certainly doable. And accountability. So how are we going to check? And one way would be to have the beginning of each meeting looking at who's done what on the action plan from the last meeting, but better still is to check that in between the meetings on a regular basis. I see loads of meetings, and we've been guilty of this as well, where you turn up for a meeting and go, right, we've got to do this, and people go, well, didn't we say we had to do that last time? We're just talking about the same stuff. Nothing's changed, and that's because nobody was given a specific task of what to do and when to do it by. Next one is to do what we call a 10 hats organisation review. There are different names for it, but it's looking at the 10 departments in your business and just working out who's in there. So you've basically got above the line strategic. So they're basically coming up with strategy and working out how to move forward. And that's shareholders and directors, often in small businesses, the same people. And then underneath the line, you've got operational, which will be leadership, which is general managers, maybe CEO in some bigger businesses. And then at the bottom, you've got effectively operational departments. So you've got product and service development, you've got the operations and delivery, you've got the sales department, the marketing department, the finance department, where the bookkeeper and payroll people are, admin and technology and human resources, and just working out who's in those departments, what their function is, what their roles are, and what measurements, what KPIs, key performance indicators might be used to see how effective that's working. And often you'll see that organisation review doesn't exist in a lot of small businesses. And when I say small, we're talking, anything up to 4 or 5 million turnover still don't have those things in place, and then wonder why everything's so effective and they're all in step 1 in the quadrant, which is urgent and important stuff needed doing immediately. So doing the 10 hats organisation review to see who's wearing those particular hats is really, really useful. Obviously, when you're a sole trader and you start off, you're probably wearing all of them, but the way to become an effective business is to get rid of some of those hats, but make sure that the people wearing it know exactly what's got to go on. So that's clear accountability lines, and also that will help you scale up the business. It's often the case that businesses grow, but actually don't have the departments built in because they've grown so quickly, they haven't had time, and then it all becomes a bit chaotic. So benefits of a 10 hats organisation, one is fairly straightforward. So there's clarity about roles, improved delegation we talked about before, clear accountability, and it identifies resource gaps and outsourcing opportunities and provides for, as I say, scaling without blowing the business up. We'll come back to that a bit later because there are some things that can be done with that. Delegation, obviously, we talked about delegating stuff in some of those quadrants to other people so that you are doing the most effective work you can do. And this is just a graphic that highlights that. So delegation, you're delegating when you basically assess the task and delegate it to the right person. You're very specific with what needs to be done, and that can be verbal and written communication. There's a reporting back, so they're not just left to their own devices, they have to come back to make sure that they understand. There's a time frame so that they know when these things have to be done. There's very clear objectives and expectations. So what will what they're doing look like when they've got it right and it's done, and set a time to review those outcomes together. That's compared to abdication. So it's important that we understand that delegation is separate to abdication. It's just basically going, there you go, get on with it. And then business owners wonder why that backfires. It's because it's abdicating responsibility rather than delegating. So abdicating is where you issue a task to anybody and forget about it. You give little or unclear information. You don't ask if they understand what you're asking or what they've got to do. There's no time frame. There's no clarity on what the objectives are or how it's supposed to look when it's done. And there's no reviewing the outcomes to see how it did look at the end. And again, if you're delegating, the result is you've got better trust and respect, better communication and motivation, more efficiency and higher productivity. That sounds so obvious, and yet delegation is so badly done often. Jobs completed on time and profitable, happy team members, happy clients and customers, and future work delegated. And obviously those people will know the process to delegate as they move up the ladder. Compared to abdicating, where the result is distrust and lack of respect, poor communication and motivation, very poor productivity and efficiency, jobs delayed or over budget, disgruntled team members, clients and customers, and no future work. So hopefully that will make sense, and we all think that's working properly, but it's certainly worth revisiting that to see if that is exactly how it's working in your business. Things are delegated rather than abdicated, and that's not just from business owners down, it's from the people underneath business owners down to the people underneath them. They may have never had a conversation about how to delegate. Okay, we'll now just look at some quick tips and tools. I mean, this list could go on for ages. I've just picked out the ones that I think fit best with today. Software, there's loads of software around. That's the big benefit of today, is that software is increasingly powerful and useful in time management. Having said that, we need to be careful that we're a master of it rather than the other way around. I have seen one client who had a fantastic piece of software where everything in theory was placed. He could move stuff around, assign it to people, and yet, you know, in terms of providing us with stuff to do what we need to do, completely disorganized. So there's so much time spending actually creating that system that there's no time to actually do anything in it. So Outlook can be a good tool. It's fairly old school now, but it still does a job. ClickUp is the one I use personally, which I think has got loads of features and benefits, and it's also the closest I've seen to being able to do everything all in one place. Trello is similar to ClickUp, not far behind in my view. Another thing we'd recommend that you might want to do is to create a not to-do list. So everybody's got a to-do list or several to-do lists. It's handy to create a not to-do list. So the way I've done it, and it can be done several different ways, is I have a sheet which has four columns in. In the first column, I just go through a week or a month and list everything I do. And then after I've got everything listed, I then move each of those into one of the three other columns. And those three columns are only I can do it, and it's important. The second column is other people can do it, but I want to do it. As business owner, I still have that choice, not a brilliant one, but it's there. And then the third column is I don't want to do it and other people can do it. And obviously that third column becomes a list to delegate. And that usually is the biggest list of the three. So you're then left with the things only you can do and the things that other people could do, but you really want to be doing it for whatever reason. And in due course, you can revisit that list, and as time goes by, you'll probably move more stuff away. Rocks, pebbles, sand. When we did the time management seminar, one of the things we did is to say we have in life rocks, which are basically the big important projects and jobs and things that have to be done, regular stuff that needs doing every week or every month. Then we've got pebbles, which is less important, but still has to be done to some extent. And then we've got sand, which is all the little things that we really need to try and fit in. And we basically say, how can you fit that into this bowl, which represents your working week or working month? And the reality is the rocks have to go in first, followed by the pebbles, followed by the sand. If you do it any other way, it won't all fit. And that's the same with work. You need to do the big stuff first. And then you basically, if you've got time, do the rest. And then if you've got time to do the other small stuff, you do. What you can't afford to do is not have this stuff that needs doing every week or every month forgotten because you're busy doing the sand type work, the things that take up your time, but could be done anytime. And one of the best ways to get around that is to have time blocks. If you know you have to do something every week, put a theoretical appointment in your calendar to say that's the time frame when I'm going to do X, because I've got to do it every week. and I don't really want to not do it because that means next week I've got to do 2 and there may be problems with delaying it and so on. So things that have to be done go in. Now, I've often seen business owners and team members say that that doesn't work in practice, but I would then counter argue that with it seems to work perfectly when those blocked out times are holidays. So nobody ever has a problem going, I've booked out a holiday, but I'm going to push it off and do some other sand type stuff. So it's only a matter of desire, in my view. Book, there are loads of time management books. They all tend to deal with things sometimes in 300 pages with only 2 or 3 ideas. Probably the best and most well-known one is Getting Things Done. I think it's by somebody called David Allen, and that's probably one of the most popular books on a system if you want a system. I've seen other business owners and very switched on people. One of them had a big glass full of marbles, and each one of those marbles represented one of those days that we talked about earlier in the webinar, which is basically the number of days left either in work life or life generally, and every day that passes one of those marbles gets taken out, and that really focuses the mind on how fragile time is and actually how little of it we have. We need to make the most of that. Standing up in meetings, that works well. If ever you've watched The West Wing, which is a very accurate representation of the United States government, they all stand up in meetings, and the reason for that is because they just go quicker. Nobody hangs around drinking tea and coffee and chatting, they just get on with it. To-do lists, obviously we all have to-do lists, but I would recommend having only 3 items on your to-do list. The most successful people have 3 or less. Certainly very successful people concentrate on 1, get it done, or get somebody else to do it and then move on rather than have 50, because there's less focus. If you have a list with 200 items on it, I would then recommend you have an important to-do list where you move 1 to 3 and then just concentrate on those 3. Know your value. This goes back to what we were talking about. And basically, if you're a business owner particularly, you have to know your value, as in what are you prepared to get out of bed for in terms of money, and are you then earning that much money with every working hour of your life? So I see business owners doing work that is earning either nothing or £5 an hour. Well, that's below minimum wage. So if you're a business owner, do the things that are actually going to generate the most value. And we looked at that with the pyramid earlier. And probably most crucially, especially if you've seen Michael Gerber in videos or read his book, is just think about how you would look back at time spent and just go, I'm really proud that I did that, and how much of what you're doing now would come into that list. And I would venture to guess that very little of it has anything to do with work or day-to-day routines. It's more likely to do with family, how we've helped people, and what we've achieved in life, rather than going through the to-do list and checking things off. So hopefully some ideas there. So very quickly, what are you now going to do with that time? And a couple of suggestions is obviously delegate and teach others what you've learned so that other people in your organization are also well trained on how to do these things. Sharpen your saw, we talked about earlier, is make sure that everything's effective and efficient, so that when things are getting done, they're getting done quicker and better. Make better plans, be more commercial. To some people, just make plans would be a good start. It's generally recognized that business owners spend more time planning holidays than they do planning their business, and we are encouraging that to stop. So planning and more commerciality, create better habits. We talked about that earlier, and that's just a mindset thing. And take time out for you. That's the whole point of time, is we want to be looking at the wellness side of things. That's what we need to do with some of our time. So whatever that means for you, that might be time off with family, kids, grandkids. It might be just time to do personal stuff on your own. It might be gym, yoga classes, or holidays, weekend breaks, whatever it is. Use some of that time for you personally. And also, don't forget that actually sat around doing nothing is still, I think, a valid way of spending some time. It's mindfulness and it just chills you out compared to the heavy rush of day-to-day stuff. So hopefully that's gone through a number of things and you've got quite a bit in your list of things to do. So let's just look at some next steps of where you can go from here. So define the distractions that you can minimize. I think that's a big part of life, is distractions. So learn how to say no to people politely. We're guilty of taking on too much and always saying yes to stuff. Don't have to do that. Clarify the habits you wish to create. So hopefully you'll have an idea of where your personal failings might be in time management and what you might be able to do to refocus that a little bit. List 3 items that you might want to move forward with. So I think 3 is maximum for the reasons we mentioned earlier, but hopefully there are at least 3 things that you've picked up from today that you can now start to look at in the coming days and weeks. Focus on what you can do rather than worry about the things that you can't do. So positive, proactive moving forward rather than just looking at the reasons why you may be being stopped to move forward, and get support wherever you can from whoever you can. Which brings us on to how we can help, because we obviously do loads of these things day to day with businesses, and these are just 4 of the most relevant, but we are happy to discuss any form of assistance you think you might need. So the 10 hats organizational review, we can do that with business owners and any managers or whoever in the team they want to attend that session. It's the same price, and that's usually a good half day with some follow-up work afterwards. Accountability coaching, so that's can really cover a multitude of sins, and that, I say, can range from a small amount of coaching to a very large amount on a regular basis. I mentioned the Achiever Matrix worksheet earlier. We can give you a copy of that free. Just email me or put in the questions Achiever Matrix worksheet and we'll get that to you. And we can just set up any complimentary meeting. So we're happy to spend an hour, hour and a half with anybody to discuss any of the issues from this, to hopefully give you some ideas, help you move things forward or put a different perspective on it. So you, again, just put free meeting in the questions or email me. For those of you who don't deal with us regularly, email address is mark@marklawson.co.uk. So again, just checking, we're running out of time. So just quickly see if there's any major questions there. I can't see anything major in there. No, that's fine. So as I say, if you have any questions and didn't put it into the chat box, then do feel free to email me and we'll deal with those later. But that either means that I've covered everything exhaustively and you're completely happy, or you're too worried about putting a question in at this stage. Either is fine. So brilliant. All it remains to say is just to give you a parting thought, which is obviously from Yoda. And that simply says, do or do not, there is no try. So I say, make sure you do some stuff from today. Taking actions is going to achieve something. Just thinking about it will still leave you exactly where you were. And that means you've just wasted an hour, unfortunately. So try and do stuff. And if you get any troubles with them or need any assistance, please feel free to get in touch with us. So make a simple plan, get those 3 actions in place. So hopefully you found enough today to be really useful and that you've got some stuff to move forward with. So I appreciate you coming along today and thank you for attending, and hopefully we'll see you at the next meeting, which will be sometime during April, and if you haven't already had invites, you shortly will be. So I hope to see you then and hope today's been worthwhile for you. So thank you and take care.